If your life is hectic like mine, you never really feel like you're getting one thing done well. Instead, you're doing a lot of things just okay. In this episode, I examine how to take a step back, build reasonable expectations, and start to figure out how to get that balance that everyone keeps talking about. Hi, I'm Nadia, and you're listening to Scripted, Unscripted, a podcast where I talk about my personal experience as a writer trying to make it and not always succeeding. Each episode covers big life concepts through small stories from my day-to-day. Sometimes my friends come to visit and we get to have a conversation about all of it. But no matter what, Scripted Unscripted is a way for me to share with you the joy and the pain of trying to live a fulfilling life. So let's get started. You are not enough. I have this feeling all the time, in my creative life, in my regular life, in my professional life. So that's what I'll be talking about today. How I figured out how to create time and space to be enough in all the areas of my life that matter to me. And in this episode, I'm going to give you a rundown of what I've done to try and manage this and how much better I've gotten at it. Then we can see if I'm enough, or maybe if you're enough too. Believe it or not, being a writer has taught me how to do that in one way or another. I've always had this recurring theme that somehow I'm not doing enough at any given time. Part of it is likely internalized capitalism, which just means that I subconsciously connect my worth to how much I'm producing. And as a writer, this includes how much I am producing creatively on any given day. Although it's nice to be productive and feel good about accomplishing things, it's not great when this is directly related to your self-esteem. Hear me out. Productivity, or the act of producing stuff, needs time, of course, duh, which is a finite resource for all of us, also duh. Creative productivity not only needs time, but it also needs space, which is a conceptual term that's related to a mental state. But I argue it's also a finite resource and demands a certain level of mindfulness, which cannot be achieved without time itself. So, to do enough, whatever that means, is to somehow have time and space to create stuff or be productive in whichever way is associated with the nuances of your lifestyle. The other day I wrote this in my journal. It's like a formula, kind of. So I wrote down time plus space equals good. Let's start when I had just graduated university and I moved to New York City to work in movies. Even back then, almost 15 years ago now, New York was really expensive. I had to make sure I was covering rent, food, transportation, and social life. So I always had to be working. In the movie industry, and specifically in production of movies, this meant freelancing from movie set to movie set, which really translates into 14 to 18-hour days, 5 days a week, for months at a time, and then maybe a 1-week break before finding the next job because you can't afford to stay out of work for long. This meant I had limited time to do anything at all. But I was very young, so the type of energy reserved for youth was something that would help me cultivate the space I needed in much less time than, for instance, it does now. Let me set the stage for you. Crown Heights, Brooklyn. A neighborhood with busy New York City-style streets, but with the hometown flavor of Brooklyn, which means low-story buildings, even some small houses. The subway stations are littered at strategic spots, and there are bodegas on every corner. And if you're lucky, you have a nearby laundromat. Mine was down the street, across from a very Brooklyn diner, which I absolutely loved. On the weekends, I wanted to be writing. But I also needed clean clothes. That's a fair statement. So I would carry this huge duffel bag of clothes on one arm and my clunky laptop on the other and head to the local laundromat. Something about the rows of washing machines on one side and the huge dryers lined up on the other, and the people with the coins and they're running their respective machines and the clothes are spinning. It was like entering a movie scene. And in that way, it was the perfect space to be writing. That and the whirring of the machines put me in kind of a trance. It was like it helped me create a space that I needed to get creative. It takes about 2 hours to do 2 loads of laundry. So I also had time. And that's the entire magic formula, the space and the time. On other days, when I wasn't doing laundry, for instance, I'd make sure to read on the subway, or even jot down scenes in a notebook, thoughts on my latest script, whatever it might be. One weekend a month, I'd go to my writing class and present my pages or help others with their own work. It was like an obsession, and any free time was used up to work on my writing. Looking back, the biggest thing I learned during this time is that writing isn't always putting pen to paper. It's being there and looking around and being in that space so that you are prepared to put pen to paper. Anyway, since I had such limited time and needed to quickly build mental space to create ideas, I would literally keep my eyes and ears open at all times. Maybe it was a blessing that this was before the dependency on cell phones, because I was people watching at every possible moment of the day. In the laundromat I told you about, when I wasn't typing or reading my own work, I'd be watching my neighbors as they put clothes into those large machines and interacted with their children or brought friends with them. I'd listen to their conversations, and if they were in a different language, I'd note their dynamics through how they were expressing themselves rather than what they were saying. And so I took notes about all of it, and it was teaching me so much. On the subway rides, I was like the original overheard memes. I just jot down anything funny or interesting that I would overhear, noting it down for future lines of dialogue or as inspiration for new ideas. I didn't always look back on this actual writing in my notebook, but it was also there when I needed it. I sort of just called it back. In any case, I was always on, and that was really important. So when the writing time, which essentially is the pen to paper time, I would do two things to create space. First, physical space. I'd pick a local cafe with my favorite coffee and go there and set up house. I've always been a sucker for baked goods, and the American muffin is everything. I dare you to argue with me. Anyway, I'd sit down, open the laptop, sip my coffee, eat my muffin. That was my physical space, and I created it to be comfortable and full of stuff I loved, including my notebook of random observations and another one of specific scenes. For my mental space, I'd reread what I had written the last weekend and somehow recall any of the people watching I'd done throughout the week. And suddenly, I was there, inside my story and captivated by my own creativity. That was me in my early 20s. I'm in my 40s now, but I can truly say that those early days helped me build my observation skills, which are still an integral part of my process, and somehow observing just comes naturally to me now. Let me jump to 10 years later, when I had a different type of profile. Newlywed, just got back from a honeymoon that we couldn't afford, and a wedding we definitely couldn't afford that I had planned in less than 3 months, and a new apartment in a new neighborhood. You could say I was in a bit of a culture shock, for lack of a better description. Out of a job, COVID hits, I'm sitting at home with loads of time, and yet absolutely no space. This probably had to do with my intense fear of change. I like things to stay the same, but you know life. Change is inevitable, and I swear it's always for the best. It just takes me a second to understand that and adjust. If you ask anyone who knows me, they know that I need some time to just wallow in doing nothing. At that time in my life, because I was doing nothing, I felt like I wasn't worth anything. Again, this is in direct relation to productivity equaling worth, and I will talk more about that later. But in any case, I didn't like it, and I needed a plan to get that space I so desperately wanted. So here's how I do it. First, I have to have a project in mind. It could be anything. A short story, a short film script, a series idea, or even a full-fledged movie script. It can be something big, something small, but it has to be entirely mine. I've always been the type to write for myself first. I know how hard and how rare it is to get my scripts made or my work published, but at the same time, I know how important it is to be writing anyway. Writing and finishing something has always been just as much about me and my learning process and my personal accomplishments than it has been really about the final outcome. So at the time, what excited me was this new series idea that I had. It was a basic idea with some basic characters. But times were tough for me emotionally, so I had small goals. I mean really small. I'm not kidding, they were small. I would have a goal of writing one sentence. And I swear, I'm not exaggerating, it would take me all day to write one sentence. Each day, I'd add a little more to that sentence. Sometimes I would add a few words to it. Sometimes I'd write a whole new sentence altogether. Then another. And eventually, I was able to get a whole paragraph. Sometimes I'd adjust my goals to be more conceptual. For instance, the goal of the day would be to imagine one character in one scene and write it out with pen and paper. These teeny tiny, minuscule goals helped me create that space that I so desperately needed, but for some reason I was fighting against. And pretty soon I got back into it and could spend half a day writing and creating until eventually I had something finished. The next phase was a few years later. I don't know if you saw this coming, but I had a baby. I had a cute little baby boy that absolutely changed everything in my life. Everything. All of it. So of course, once again, I had to reassess how the hell I was going to get anything done. And believe me, the idea that I wasn't enough was suddenly front and center. I'm not sure how to explain exactly how it all changed, although I know that new moms and new parents already know what I'm talking about, but it's like living in a new world. Of course, there is immediately after giving birth when there's a few months of maternity leave that I took and I wanted to focus on not losing my mind inside this new thing called motherhood. But I'm not talking about those moments. I'm talking about after that. When the dust settles and you've got to live and work and create alongside a little person that you're taking care of. I used to be able to take that time to wallow and not do anything. I was alone to figure out how to deal with the lack of time or the lack of mental space, emotional space, or both. As a new parent, you do not get any of those things. And when you do, it's never enough. Having a baby was brand new and I had no tools to get back into my creative life. So I tried everything. I tried working when he napped. Nope, because, I needed to do other things like eat or shower or, I don't know, cry. Whatever. I'm lucky enough to be able to hire help. But remember that culture shock I had because my life had changed when I got married? This change, it's like change on steroids. It's like change forever. It's like change all the time. Culture shock is on hyperdrive. In retrospect, I could have been kinder to myself during that time when I was figuring this stuff out, but I realize now it's all a process. And I can finally say I maybe have figured out a few things. For me, and again, I don't know if I have all the answers. I'm always just sharing what my experience was and see if it relates to anybody. It was all about, for me anyway, it was all about compartmentalizing. There's time for work, time for myself, and time for my son. And they are all important and they are all a priority. I'm serious, they're all a priority. My son is number one, and he is always number one. So if he ever needs me, if he gets sick or has anything that's outside the daily routine, of course, everything gets set aside and we're all there for him. But that's not what I mean. I'm talking about the regular days where everybody's routine is set up and it's moving like a machine. That's when I really need to place things in specific boxes and not move them. So I drive him to nursery in the morning. And either I go to exercise, it's just something I do for myself, or I head straight to the office, which is because I work creatively, is both for myself and my job. Once I get to the office, I make sure that I work on my most challenging creative business. This might mean a project that's entirely my own if I have the space and the time for it, or it might be something I'm commissioned to do for work. But I always start with the hardest thing I have to do, and I set a goal and work for the next few hours. I usually have lunch about middle of the day, and then I pick up my son. It's like a elongated break. And then I head back to the office to finish up emails and plans for the next day, making sure that I can meet the deadlines that I have set. I'm home an hour before he goes to bed, and I get him all ready, and I get to play, which is my favorite. And then he falls asleep, and after that, it's sort of like watching a movie or a series that I usually, fall asleep very early in the night. In the past, I used to be able to work after hours. And believe me, I have tried it during motherhood. I mean, after all, he's just sleeping in his crib, but I just can't. I don't have the space or the energy for it. I learned this the hard way, but I was setting deadlines as if all of my time outside my son's needs is workable, and it's just not. I don't have the time or the space or the energy for that, and that's okay. I just have to adjust what those deadlines mean. On the weekends, I made a very specific, very deliberate goal of being one-on-one with my son full time. It's because I need that time and I cherish it, and I shouldn't be working. And that's when I realized time and space and everything I've been talking about also exists in life's relationships. I hope I don't sound like I have it all figured out in the way that I don't screw it up sometimes, or sometimes, hell, it just doesn't work the way that I want it to. And I have made a lot of mistakes along the way. But in this particular instance, that wasn't one of them. Meaning, I used to make myself available any time of day and on the weekends and whenever anyone needed anything that had to do with my work, with my productivity. But when my son came into my life, I set really strict boundaries about which time could be used for what. And that's what I mean by compartmentalization. Each element of my life had a compartment. And again, I'm not perfect. I still struggle with feelings of guilt. So like when the compartment is the work compartment, the time and the space and the energy for work, I always feel like, oh no, maybe I should be with my son. And then when I'm with him, I'm like, oh no, maybe I should be working because I didn't finish what I was supposed to finish. And blah, blah, blah. It's part of it. And it just means that, yes, I keep thinking that I'm never enough. That was my mantra. But I didn't realize what it was doing to me internally. It was making my productivity and my general creative power a lot weaker. And it was a slow and gradual erosion, so I didn't even know it was happening. I had a lot of trouble keeping up because I was never enough. And that's a really dangerous feeling. I know there are plenty of reasons for feeling like this, but it wasn't until recently that I ventured a guess on why this might be happening with me at the time that it was happening with me. And I found my answer in that concept that I call the space to truly be myself. I couldn't cultivate that space in the same way I could before because I had a lot of restrictions and my time was needed elsewhere always. Those compartments that I've been talking about were really helpful so I could manage, but it meant that I wasn't very flexible. If you take one compartment out, the whole thing falls apart. That's when I decided to go back to those tiny goals. But it happened to be the new year. So the inevitable talk of resolutions came up, and I really can't stand those. They're always so big and so sweeping, and I've never been able to keep up with any resolution that I made. So I decided to change that word and call it habits. I asked myself, which habits did I miss? What did I want to do for myself that reminded me of who I was when I had that kind of space to create? The answer that I came up with for me was journaling and reading. But I had to be realistic. So I set a goal of 10 minutes. 10 minutes of journaling first thing in the morning. This was non-negotiable. Journaling was a must. Right after that, I wanted to read for 10 minutes. That was a bonus. And I thought I could do 10 minutes, but 20 might be asking too much. I know, that sounds crazy, but it's the truth. So I started with only a 3-day goal. If I could journal for 3 days in a row, then I'd continue. If not, I would reassess and see if I needed even tinier goals. I'm well into 4 months, and maybe I skipped a day here and there, but it's pretty consistent. And it's weird because just journaling, just those 10 minutes, and the results are huge. I became more productive in my day-to-day, more aware, more present, happier, funnier. I mean, I think I got funnier. It's not as if I was writing anything profound in my journal. It's just nonsense thoughts or feelings. Sure, occasionally something about a character that I'm writing might come up, but that's rare. It's just dumping my thoughts and my feelings and anything and everything. I believe this works because it's like manipulating yourself into making that space that we've been talking about. Now that I reflect on it, I can't believe that it took me so long to understand that 10 minutes of solo time, 10 minutes that is entirely my own, is actually not easy to come by. It's a habit that must be formed. It's even made me kinder to myself. It's still a struggle to disconnect my productivity to my self-worth, but I'm much better at it. On the slow days where I really am not doing much, I unconsciously feel accomplished because I wrote in my journal that day. For me, it's hard to think of those 10 minutes being used for anything else. After all, I recommend journaling to everyone, regardless if they're writers or not. I know I'm being very specific about journaling, and some people might think that that's because I'm a writer, but I recommend journaling for everybody. It's because I just can't think of any other way to empty your thoughts from your head and out into the world. Maybe there are other ways, but so far this has been the best for me. And it's just a small habit that I can recommend for everybody. Don't get me wrong, it's not like journaling has some magic potion. I still have to compartmentalize. I still feel guilty. I'm still very aware that the use of my time must be specific and isn't often flexible. So, for instance, I can't just decide to work on the weekends or skip bedtimes with my son. But it's that small habit of journaling and the space that I've created for me that kind of finds a way to spread into all the other compartments. It's definitely made me a better writer, but I assure you, not the writing in the journal itself, but the act of journaling. Because I'm happier and more at ease. And maybe, I don't know if I could say this, but maybe it's even made me a better mom. I hope so anyway. Thank you for listening to Scripted Unscripted. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone. And tune into a bonus episode where I have a chat with an amazing working mom all about how she finds time and space to get creative. This podcast is brought to you by CMS, yours truly, Nadia, and of course, my lovely producer, Hind.